On today's show, the Nets' Michael Porter Jr. trade looks like a home run amid Cam Johnson's struggles. I'll tell you why, despite fan criticisms, Sean Marks has more than earned trust on the trade market on today's episode of Locked On Nets.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to Locked On Nets, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. The show is 100% free on all those great platforms. And on today's episode, I'm going to be revisiting the Nets' Michael Porter Jr. Cam Johnson trade that they made this summer, outlining what it says about Sean Marks, also how Jordi Fernandez comes out looking good in the equation, and how fans, it should impact what they say and what they view about this Nets front office in regards to the trade market moving forward. But the reason I'm talking about this is because Cam Johnson, former Nets fan favorite to some, had a career best season last year. Hasn't been so, things haven't been so peachy with him in Denver right now. He has been struggling in a pretty significant way, and he had his worst game of the season in the Nuggets' last game, a loss to the Minnesota Timberwolves. He was scoreless in 23 minutes, 0 for 6 from the field, 0 of 4 from 3. And I'm not picking this time right now just to do this podcast and victory lap for the Nets on this trade or bash Cam Johnson or anything along those lines. But this is a trade that, as the season has progressed, has continued to look like more and more of a slam dunk home run transaction by Sean Marks, and one of Sean Marks' best transactions. And I'm going to get into why I feel that this trade is another example of why Sean Marks, there are some areas where, he doesn't have the trust of Nets fans. There are some areas where he should have the trust of Nets fans. And the trade market is definitely one of those. And I'm going to get into why. But I also just want to touch briefly on what the discourse surrounding this trade was in the summer, because it's really started. It seems like there's a tendency, like the Nets get a lot of heat. They get bashed by a lot of people for a lot of different things. Look, I spoke about that on a recent Fan Take Friday episode. I don't think that's always unwarranted. The Nets have put themselves in a lot of positions where they've been embarrassed in the recent history, since their move to Brooklyn, and, they get clowned for it, rightfully so in some scenarios. But I think there's also other times where people are really quick to judge the Nets, whether a trade like this one, whether their draft picks this summer, and you got to give it a little bit more time, and the Nets actually come out looking a lot better. And I definitely think that this Michael Porter Jr. transaction is one of those, because if you guys remember back, there were a lot of people, it was a polarizing trade. Like, there were people on both ends of the fences, but a lot of people thought that this was a slam dunk trade for the Nuggets. That was a common opinion in the media. And like Bill Simmons, I did a podcast about it in the summer. He even called this trade one of the worst trades of the decades by the Nets. And I said at the time that I like the trade for the Nets. I said that I thought that it was a win-win for both sides. I might come out looking wrong in that regard on the Denver end. But for the Nets, I definitely liked it, mostly because of the unprotected 2032 first-round pick that they got from Denver, which was an incredible asset to get for Cam Johnson. But aside from that pick, I also said that I felt the pendulum had swung a little too far in the Cam Johnson direction in the debate between him and MPJ, players who are obviously similar archetypes, similar positions. And that's, it's not surprising that the pendulum had swung that far towards Cam Johnson looking back on it, because MPJ was coming off a playoff series where he was injured, had a bum shoulder, and he didn't play well as a result. And Cam Johnson had just had a career season. So because of that, I think a lot of Nuggets fans and a lot of people talking about this trade in the media thought that the Nuggets were getting this, significant upgrade over Michael Porter Jr. I always thought that it was a little strange to think that. Did I think Cam Johnson maybe could have been an upgrade for what the Denver Nuggets needed? Possibly, but the idea of him being this vast upgrade, I didn't really see that, and that has played out this season. I mean, we all know what Michael Porter Jr. has done this season, but you look at Cam Johnson, he hasn't really been that big of a needle mover for the Denver Nuggets. And you look at him over his last 10 games, he's really struggling. He's at 9.9 points per game, 39% shooting from the field, and 33% from three. That's the last 10 games for the season. He's at 11.2 points, 3.8 rebounds, 2.3 assists, 59.1% true shooting. So on the surface, like, the numbers aren't terrible for the season. He had a good stretch, in November to December, but you look at it, like, if you watch the Nuggets as of late before doing this pod, I went back and rewatched some of their last, their recent close games. And Cam Johnson has just not been a needle mover for them offensively. Like, he has just been, obviously the role is completely different. What he's playing with this Nuggets team as a third, fourth option versus the top guy he was on the Nets last season. But he really has added very little juice to that Denver offense. And he really has struggled, being a shot maker and kind of filling the role that they need to be, because some of the things that Cam Johnson did great last season, he was obviously a knockdown three-point shooter, movement three-point shooter on high volume, but he also added some ancillary scoring, some ancillary shot creation, mid-range shots, playmaking, getting to the rim a little bit more. And he hasn't really done any of that. Like, obviously he has less opportunity with the role change, but the overall shooting, the volume is down. He's at a career low in three-point attempts per 100 possessions. The efficiency is still up. He's over 40%, but he just hasn't added, kind of that shot-making, secondary creator feel, cutter. Some of the things that Michael Porter Jr. has done great. I mean, Cam Johnson just hasn't come up, in those same areas, making the same kind of impact. And then you look at also the clutch numbers. I mean, I took a brief look at those. It's small sample size, but he's 1 of 8 from the field and 1 of 6 from 3 in the clutch. And across his 2.5 seasons with the Nets, I mean, Nets fans undoubtedly remember this. He was not a very good clutch performer. Across those 2.5 seasons, Cam Johnson was 15 of 54 from 3 in the clutch. That's 28%. So I'm not saying all this to bash Cam Johnson, but I'm just saying that, the trade that the Nets made, to me, it looks like a complete home run. I liked it at the time, and that's for a lot of reasons. And I think it's beginning to look more clear when you look at Cam Johnson's production. Also, the injury issues. I mean, Cam Johnson has only played in 37 games this year. He's out again tonight in the Nuggets game against the Jazz. So the most games that he's going to play this season, the max, is 58 games. And that goes back to another thing surrounding the discourse of this trade. I mean, Bill Simmons was talking about MPJ's injury history when outlining his reasoning for why it was such a dumb trade by Brooklyn. And I just remember thinking when I heard that, like, do you know who the other guy in this deal is? Like, Cam Johnson has played more than 65 games once in his career. This will be the 4th straight season that he doesn't crack 60 games. So, not saying all of this to bash Cam Johnson. I just think that there is a tendency in the media, amongst some people, to bash the Nets when they make some of these types of moves, whether or not that's fair. Sometimes it's fair, sometimes it's not. I do not think that this was one of those cases. And you look at MPJ, I mean, everybody knows what he's done this season. And obviously his role to Cam Johnson's role, they could not be more different. But MPJ's at 24.5 points, 7 rebounds, 3.1 assists. And he's posted a higher true shooting percentage than Cam Johnson, 60.5%, despite his volume being like nearly triple. And, the degree of difficulty of the shots that he's taking just being night and day. I mean, people talk about the Jokic bump, and Cam Johnson went from the Nets to supposedly, or, you thought would get the Jokic bump, and Michael Porter Jr. going from Jokic to not Jokic. And Michael Porter Jr. has been, the far more efficient player. And I think that says something about Jordi Fernandez, which I'm going to get into. But this also says something about Sean Marks, because Sean Marks, I said, my hook for this episode was that he has more than earned the trade trust of Nets fans, in my opinion. And you look at it, Sean Marks gets a lot of hate. I understand why, from Nets fans. He's been here for a decade. He's won 1 playoff series. He's definitely come up short in some areas. But the trade market has not been one of those. And one of the common criticisms of Sean Marks on the trade market is that he waits too long to make deals. He unquestionably wants to win transactions and won't settle for transactions where he doesn't look like the clear winner. And a big example of that people point to is the Dorian Finney-Smith trade. Brian Lewis reported that the Nets were offered 2 first-round picks to flip Dorian Finney-Smith after they got him in the Kyrie Irving trade of the 2023 trade deadline. And Marks ended up holding him until midway through last season when he was effectively an expiring contract, and he ends up getting 3 second-round picks for him. So that's the most egregious example where you can say, Sean Marks waited too long. It was a bad trade. But that had more to do with the Nets' objectives and what the Nets' objectives were. Because you look at it, after the Nets made those Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving trades at the 2023 deadline, they weren't trying to tear it down. They were trying to stay competitive. And you would think that directive came from ownership and Joe Tsai. So if the Nets are trying to stay competitive, trading Dorian Finney-Smith at that point, one of the key players that they got back in those transactions and the guy who was going to be a starter for them, it didn't really make much sense at that point if the goal was to remain competitive. So I don't think that you can blame Sean Marks too much for that one. And then you look at the trades outside of that have been his biggest transactions. It's been the last 3 big trades. It's been the Kevin Durant trade, in conjunction, the Mikal Bridges trade, a couple years later, and then the Michael Porter Jr. trade. And Sean Marks, in my opinion, has waited on all of those trades longer than people, thought that was prudent, or longer than people thought that he would. You look at the Kevin Durant trade, they held him for half a season after he went to really extreme lengths to try to get out of Brooklyn. And the Sean Marks held him, said, we're not going to trade him until we get what we want. And he ends up getting a king's ransom for him. And then the Mikal Bridges trade, same thing. This Cam Johnson trade, a lot of people thought that the Nets should have made it at the deadline last year. Sean Marks ends up holding him until the offseason. All three of those transactions, the Kevin Durant trade has grown into a trade return that was, 9 or 10 first-round picks, plus Michael Porter Jr., Zaire Williams, some other guys. The Mikal Bridges trade, obviously, an immense trade win for the Nets, getting 5 first-round picks and a swap for a player who has never made an all-star team. And this Michael Porter Jr. trade, same thing. So I think that Sean Marks' trade resume, I think it speaks for itself, and I think that he has more than earned the trust of Nets fans in that regard. And I'm going to talk about how he's going to navigate things with Michael Porter Jr. moving forward, but I also want to talk about Jordi Fernandez and what this says about him, because you got two players in Cam Johnson and Michael Porter Jr., both of whom had career seasons under Jordi Fernandez. Why is that? What is Jordi Fernandez doing that is getting the most out of some of these guys? I'll get into that when I continue Locked On Nets after a quick break. Workplace chaos, deadline stacking up, inbox overflowing, and the one position you have to fill is still sitting open. When the pressure's on and you need the right hire, that's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps you reach people who actually fit what you're looking for. Skills, experience, location, so you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. And here's a stat that says it all. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, that's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? That's a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Coming back from the break on today's Locked On Nets episode, revisiting Brooklyn's Michael Porter Jr. trade. And I talked in the first segment about why I think that was one of Sean Marks' best transactions and why I think that he has earned the trade trust of Nets fans. And another guy who is earning trust, and I think that this transaction and the performance of the two players involved can exemplify that, is Jordi Fernandez. Because you look at it, Cam Johnson, the reason why I think the Nets were able to get what I think is such a good return for him is because of the way that he played last season under Jordi Fernandez, and the way that Jordi Fernandez was able to craft an offense around Cam Johnson to get him open shots in rhythm, to get the most out of him as a secondary or tertiary shot creator. And the Nets were able, because of that, to flip him for a trade that's looking like a huge home run. And we're seeing the same thing with Michael Porter Jr. this season. The way that Jordi Fernandez has designed the offense around Michael Porter Jr., he came into the season and you thought, how is this going to work with Michael Porter Jr. as a lead option? Because he's a guy who was obviously a third or a fourth option during his time in Denver, and he's a guy who is not a high-level ball handler or a shot creator in the traditional sense. So how are the Nets going to craft the offense around him to maximize his skill set? And we've seen Jordi Fernandez do that in a very effective way by the ways that they've had Michael Porter Jr. moving off the ball and the way that they've been able to leverage his gravity in order to make everybody around him better. And sure, like Michael Porter Jr. has had some recent struggles, and Nets are obviously a bad team. But you look at what Jordi Fernandez has been able to get out of Michael Porter Jr. production-wise. I said 24.5 points, 7.0 rebounds, 3.1 assists, 60.5% true shooting, despite his recent struggles, has still been one of the most efficient players in the NBA. You look at the way that Jordi Fernandez has designed the offense, it's obviously been based around Michael Porter Jr.'s elite shot making, his elite off-ball movement. And I think that we talked to Jordi Fernandez before the season. I asked him, does he envision Michael Porter Jr. having a big uptick in pick and roll ball handling, a big uptick in isolation possessions. And Jordi was pretty black and white right out of the gate. And he said that I don't envision that, because I don't envision Michael Porter Jr., MPJ's ball handling to be the thing that he is strongest at or one of his top strengths. So with that, Jordi Fernandez has designed the offense around Michael Porter Jr.'s shooting, obviously his ability to come off these pin downs, his ability to curl around, make ridiculously tough three-point shots, but also the gravity that elite shot making presents with the way you see the Nets running split actions, the way you see him, Michael Porter Jr., when opposing teams try to top lock a screen, which means get on top of it so Michael Porter Jr. can't come off those pin downs. You get the high-low dump-offs. You get the backdoor cuts, all of the off-ball movement. I think that Jordi Fernandez has been able to put Michael Porter Jr. in positions where he's able to flow naturally in and out of actions and get himself some easier looks to counteract some of the really difficult looks that he undoubtedly has to end up taking. So that has been a major positive of Jordi Fernandez. And we saw the same thing with Cam Johnson last season in a little bit of a different way, but we saw Jordi Fernandez able to design that offense around Cam Johnson and Michael Porter Jr. And on top of that, I think that Jordi Fernandez, the messaging that he gives off with some of these Nets players also reflects really positively and also helps them in terms of their confidence and their ability, the ability of him and this Nets coaching staff to get the most out of them. Because if you listen to the Old Man and the Three podcast, Michael Porter Jr. actually did a podcast with Cam Johnson, which I thought was really interesting. One thing that Michael Porter Jr. talked about that Cam Johnson attested to was the degree to which Jordi Fernandez is telling his players to get up shots. Michael Porter Jr., if you've watched the Nets this season, you know that he takes some just audacious shots. He takes shots that you think are completely ridiculous when they're coming out of his hands. He makes them a lot more than other players because he's just such a ridiculous shot maker. But that, on the surface, you could look at that and say, like, Michael Porter Jr. is an unserious player. Michael Porter Jr., is just a chucker and things along those lines. But if you listen to the way Michael Porter Jr. talks about it in that podcast and things that I've heard behind the scenes, Jordi Fernandez is telling guys to get him up. He's telling guys to shoot. If you're open and you have any open space, you need to be putting the ball up. And I think that takes on a little bit of a more intense definition with Michael Porter Jr. or meaning with Michael Porter Jr. because he is the Nets' top guy and they're relying on him so heavily offensively this season. But we've heard the same thing from other players. Like I heard that from Zaire Williams last season after he got traded to the Nets. He said that Jordi Fernandez is telling him, the coaches are telling him to take shots that he considers bad shots sometimes. But that's just what they want. And you heard the same thing from Michael Porter Jr., some shots that he thinks are just ridiculous. Jordi Fernandez is chastising him for not taking them. And what is that doing? That's instilling a level of confidence in players because you know that you have the green light all the time. You know that your head coach wants you to get those shots up. You innately feel a sense of confidence and a sense of, motivation to put those shots up. So I think getting the confidence into these players is one thing, but I also think it's kind of drilling in the ways that Jordi Fernandez and this Nets coaching staff wants the team to play, because that's one of the biggest things about these, last two seasons under Jordi Fernandez. Nets obviously aren't winning. They're one of the worst teams in the league in both of these last two seasons. But one of the main goals for Jordi Fernandez and this Nets coaching staff is drilling it in the heads of the guys who are going to be here for the long run, how he wants them to play. And a big part of that is taking a lot of threes. A big part of that is if you get a catch and shoot look and you're even somewhat open, putting it up. So the messaging, I think, from Jordi Fernandez, his ability to design offenses around players with different skill sets and his ability to kind of drive home messaging of how he wants to play and get players to buy into that, I think that has really been on display during these last two seasons. And I think the play of a guy like Cam Johnson, the play of a guy like Michael Porter Jr., getting career best seasons out of those guys, I think that is an example of that. But with Michael Porter Jr., like Cam Johnson, there were questions at the trade deadline about how the Nets were going to handle him. They end up holding him through the trade deadline. And I think that it's a situation that could end up playing out similarly to what we saw with Cam Johnson. So what should Nets fans be expecting on that front? What have I been hearing? We'll get to all that when I close out Locked On Nets after a quick break. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. March is the time to celebrate women, especially around International Women's Day, and to just recognize how much they carry at work, in relationships, in families, and in all the unseen roles they step into every day. It's easy to celebrate women's strength, but it's just as important to make space for their emotional well-being, and therapy can be one way to do that. Guys, think about all the women in your life, the important ones, the ones that lift you up every day, whether a mother, a significant other, a sister, a best friend. They deserve support too, and therapy can create balance and offer a space to focus on themselves. With over 30,000 licensed therapists and more than 6 million people served worldwide, BetterHelp makes getting started simple. You fill out a short questionnaire, they match you with a licensed therapist, and if it's not the right fit, you can switch at any time. Your emotional well-being matters. Find support and feel lighter in therapy. Sign up and get 10% off at BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. That's BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. College basketball is nonstop. Big games, tight spreads, momentum swings every single night. From early tip-offs to late West Coast shootouts, there's always action on the board. And now FanDuel is giving you a way to turn that energy into even bigger potential wins with a college basketball parlay profit boost. You can build any college hoops parlay you want, rivalry games, ranked matchups, whatever fits your read. You can mix spreads, totals, and player props to match how you see the slate playing out. Then you can apply the profit boost and instantly bump up the potential payout. You can look at odds surrounding your team wherever they are at in the season. So go safe, go bold, ride with the team you've been following all season. It's your parlay, your style, now with more upside behind it. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel. Play your game. Coming back from the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about Brooklyn's Michael Porter Jr. trade this past summer. And now, how are they going to move forward with Michael Porter Jr.? Because my main point at the top of this episode was that Sean Marks, despite whatever criticisms that Nets fans have of him, he has more than earned the trust of Brooklyn fans through his trade resume, through the deals that he's been able to pull off and how they have ended up working out. And you look at Michael Porter Jr., the Nets, there was a lot of talk around him at the trade deadline. He was perceived as one of the top available players on the market at the deadline. And despite that, the Nets hold on to him, and they have him coming into the offseason now where he has 1 year left on his contract at $40 million. The Nets are obviously moving forward in a rebuild, and how they kind of proceed with him is going to be one of the main decisions, or one of the most important decisions outside of obviously the draft that the Nets have to make this summer. And based on things that I've heard, I would expect this to play out somewhat similarly to what we saw with Cam Johnson and how that worked out. Because you go back to last year's trade deadline, Cam Johnson was another guy. There was a ton of trade smoke surrounding him, and Sean Marks ultimately ends up holding on to him, and then he ends up seeing how the draft lottery plays out, seeing how the draft plays out, and then trading Cam Johnson a day after the draft. And that is something that I can see, a blueprint or a roadmap that I can see playing out very similarly as it pertains to Michael Porter Jr. Because, from me poking around and things I heard about the way that the Nets were handling Michael Porter Jr. at the trade deadline, the messaging was very similar to what we heard about the Cam Johnson trade market a year prior. And that was that the Nets weren't actively shopping Michael Porter Jr., that they were taking calls from several interesting teams. That's the same thing that we heard in regard to Cam Johnson's trade market at the deadline the year prior. We also heard the Nets had a very high asking price for Michael Porter Jr. They were potentially going to be looking for 2 first-round picks. Also, the same thing as what we heard about Cam Johnson the year prior. And the last thing we heard is that the Nets are more than comfortable holding Michael Porter Jr. through the trade deadline and that they can envision him as part of their long-term plans. Also, the same thing that we heard about Cam Johnson the year prior. And while that is something that the Nets had been putting out in terms of the messaging of them being willing to keep MPJ, he could be a long-term piece. I've heard some things that I would be a little bit surprised if they don't revisit the trade market with MPJ in a very serious way this summer. And I'll take it even a step further to say, if MPJ is not traded this summer, I would be somewhat surprised, because you have MPJ who's coming off this career season. In July, he's going to be eligible for an extension. He's going to be looking for an extension. And if you're the Nets, if you're going to keep him, you're going to extend him because he only has 1 year left on his contract. You don't want him to get to free agency. So, with that being the case, the Nets are going to be put in a decision. Do they trade him or do they sign him to an extension and move forward with him? And I think that, based on things I've heard, the trade route is much more likely. And I think that, I feel confident in saying that based on things I've heard, but also based on the roadmap and the things that you've been hearing kind of matching what the Nets did with how they handled Cam Johnson the year prior. And I think that it just makes sense. Like, you look at Michael Porter Jr., he's getting to be 28 years old. He's going to be coming off of a career season. He's going to be wanting an extension. Could the Nets keep him? Sure. Like, if they kept him and they got him on a reasonable number, do I think it would be a bad move? I wouldn't extend him based on, how he matches up with the timeline, based on his injury history. But if you can get him at a reasonable number, then I can see it. But if he's going to be looking for, 4 years at $40+ million, if you're talking about a 4-year, $160 million plus contract, I'd be very wary of that. And because of, how we saw Sean Marks operate, like we saw him sell high on a guy like Cam Johnson, I think that you're going to see a similar approach with Michael Porter Jr. And with him coming off of a career season, with you getting into the summer where the Giannis Antetokounmpo sweepstakes, that was something that held up a large portion of the NBA at the trade deadline. With that, potentially gaining some clarity during the offseason, with every year, several teams who thought that they were player contenders, liked where their rosters were at, have early playoff exits. They're looking to bolster their rotations during the offseason. You also have the draft lottery happening, the draft happening, the Nets getting a better sense of where they are in terms of their assets, as is the rest of the league. All of that, I think, will make for Michael Porter Jr. to have a clearer and more expansive trade market during the offseason. And with that, I think that the Nets will definitely be exploring avenues and exploring the trade market for Michael Porter Jr. Do they ultimately move him? If I had to answer right now, I lean yes. I don't think it's a definite, but I think that there's a very good chance that Michael Porter Jr. could be on the move this summer. And I think the Nets will be able to get a good return for him, because you look at what they got for Cam Johnson. Also, that was obviously kind of a pseudo salary dump at the same time, but they got an impact player while he was somewhat of a distressed asset, an impact player and a future unprotected first-round pick. And Michael Porter Jr. has been even better this season than Cam Johnson was last season. And he's on an expiring contract. So I think the Nets will be able to get a good overall return for him. And that just speaks back to the overall strength of the trade that Sean Marks made this past offseason, because getting that unprotected 2032 first-round pick from the Denver Nuggets, that was one of the best assets that I think the Nets could have gotten. I was shocked that they were able to get that in a deal for Cam Johnson. And you talk about getting that on top of another first-round pick, maybe multiple draft picks, maybe a young player involved, just the overall trade return the Nets are going to be able to, the trade value the Nets are going to be able to extract from Cam Johnson. It's going to be really impressive, I think, once we get out of this coming offseason and you look back and you reevaluate on it. But that's all I got for you guys on today's episode of Locked On Nets. If you guys do not already, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you enjoy my content, take a second right now, smash that like button, leave a comment, leave a 5-star review. Anything you can do to engage is much appreciated. Let's got a day off. They're going to be back in action on Tuesday in Miami. I will be in Miami covering that game, so I'll have coverage of all that and more when I'm back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.